Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another in our series of events from the James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions here at Princeton University. I'm Allen Guelzo. I'm the director of the Madison program's Initiative on Politics and Statesmanship and the Thomas W. Smith Distinguished Research Scholar in the Madison program. When I was still a teenager, with starry-eyed dreams about classical music, I watched a Sunday afternoon broadcast by Leonard Bernstein in his Young People's Concert series with the New York Philharmonic. What caught my ear in that broadcast was a symphony I had never heard before by a composer about whom I knew absolutely nothing, William Levi Dawson. The music was Dawson's only symphony, composed in 1934 and revised in 1952, and it was based on musical motifs drawn from his own vast acquaintance with what W.E.B. Du Bois called the sorrow songs of Black America. I remember that afternoon with the rare moment of clarity that comes with adolescence and surprise. And in particular, I remember thinking, after hearing especially the symphony's middle movement, Hope in the Night, that if Tchaikovsky is what grace sounds like, and Rachmaninoff is what longing sounds like, then this is what hope sounds like. I had to have this. There was one extant vinyl LP with Leopold Stokowski as conductor, and the score was available from Shawnee Press. I still have both. But I couldn't shake the question. Why hadn't I heard of William Levi Dawson and his symphony before? The answer to that question is what our program is about tonight, and I hope I will not be giving anything away prematurely when I say that William Levi Dawson is a symbol for an erasure from an American memory. An erasure springing partly from race, an erasure springing partly from the demand of modernist composers of the 1920s, that any American music before that time be dismissed as amateurish and subpar. It was an erasure which we had been warned about, even before William Dawson was born, by no one less than Antonín Dvořák in 1893. The black music he heard sung in America convinced him that here is all that is needed for a great and noble school of music, and I intend to do all in my power to call attention to the splendid treasure of melody which you have. He practiced what he preached, too, wrapping black music into his Ninth Symphony from the New World, into the American Suite of 1894, into his American Quartet of 1893. And he kept on preaching, too. The so-called plantation songs are indeed the most striking and appealing melodies that have been found on this side of the water, Dvorak wrote in the Century magazine in February 1895. There is nothing in the whole range of composition that cannot be supplied with themes from this source. But I'm stealing too much thunder. That is the story which my friend and collaborator Joseph Horowitz is bringing us tonight, the story of Dvorak's prophecy. Described in the New York Times as a force in classical music today, a prophet and an agitator, Joseph Horowitz is a graduate of Swarthmore College and has been a vital part of the American classical music scene as a music critic for the New York Times, executive director of the Brooklyn Philharmonic Orchestra, co-founder of the Post-Classical Ensemble, and of Music Unwound. He's even better known as a pioneering voice in writing the forgotten history of American music. In Wagner Nights, An American History, Classical Music in America, A History of Its Rise and Fall, Moral Fire, Musical Portraits from America's Fin de siècle, and a forthcoming study of the cultural Cold War, The Propaganda of Freedom. We welcome him tonight, particularly for his book, Dvorak's Prophecy and the Vexed Fate of Black Classical Music, which won Best of the Year awards from the Financial Times, the Chicago Tribune, and Kirkus Reviews. As one of our other participants tonight, John McWhorter, has said, Horowitz has taught me to listen to black classical music as what the most American of classical music is. His lesson should resound. Sidney Outlaw, whom you heard singing this evening at our very beginning, is a member of the Vocal Arts faculty at the Manhattan School of Music, at Ithaca College, and with the Opera Institute at the Brevard Music Center Festival. He holds a Bachelor in Music Performance from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and a Master of Vocal Arts from the Juilliard School. Described as an opera powerhouse, he is a baritone with a long list of prizes. Grand Prize winner of the Concurso Internacional de Canto Montserrat Caballé and the Florida Grand Opera YPO vocal competition. He's also participated in an equally impressive list of operatic roles. Schaunard from La Bohème, Prince Yamadori in Madama Butterfly, Guglielmo in Così fan tutte, Papageno in Die Zauberflöte, Ariadante in Handel's Xerxes, and Demetrius in Britain's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Tonight, he will join with Joseph Horowitz in performance of arrangements by Antonín Dvořák's African-American protege, Harry Burleigh. John McWhorter is an associate professor of linguistics at Columbia University, where he also teaches American studies and music history. He has degrees from Rutgers, New York University, and Stanford, and specializes in Creole languages. He has written over 20 books on language, dialect, and race, but has also written a host of essays on public topics for Time, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New Republic, City Journal, the New Yorker, the Beast, the Daily Beast, and CNN. And he's a regular opinion columnist for the New York Times. He will also be happy to tell you that he plays the piano. And he has had roles in what he calls small productions of Stephen Sondheim's Merrily We Roll Along and Into the Woods. Above all, it was his attendance at the 1976 revival of Porgy and Bess, which was the event that he said shattered me utterly and remains one of the most cathartic theater experiences of my life. Well, tonight, I believe we have some cathartic experiences of our own in store. But for those, I turn first to Joseph Horowitz.
Thank you, Alan. So my book is about Dvorak's prophecy. You already heard, if you didn't already know, what that was. He said in 1893 that the so-called Negro melodies that he came to know, partly through Harry Burleigh, about whom more in a moment, would foster a great and noble school of American music, by which he meant American classical music. This prophecy was more or less repeated more eloquently about 10 years later by W.E.B. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk. He called the sorrow songs of the slaves the greatest gift of the Negro people. And Du Bois, who went to school in Germany and was a Wagnerite, was also thinking about sonatas, concertos, operas that would appropriate the black musical motherlode. But these prophecies were pretty much wrong. American classical music stayed white, and why that happened is one of the core topics of my book. Of course, Dvorak wasn't entirely wrong, and this wonderful black motherlode wound up generating popular music genres that are known the world over. So the story of black classical music, simplified, begins with Harry Burleigh, and we just heard Sidney sing Harry Burleigh's arrangement, a wonderful arrangement of Steal Away. Who was Burleigh? Burleigh was a young black man from Erie, Pennsylvania, who Dvorak chose to be his assistant at the National Conservatory of Music in New York, 1892 to 1895. That Dvorak should have chosen a young black man to be his assistant already tells you something about Dvorak. And it was after Dvorak died that Burleigh took the initiative of turning these songs into concert songs for a solo singer and piano. So if you've ever heard Paul Robeson or Marian Anderson sing Deep River, that's Burleigh's Deep River. That's a landmark event in the history of American music. Burleigh isn't nearly as much remembered as he deserves to be for moving this repertoire into the concert hall. Previously, if you had heard spirituals in concert, they would have been sung by a black vocal quartet or somewhat larger group of black singers, the most famous being the Fisk Jubilee Singers, a group that still exists in Nashville, Tennessee. An interesting question, and the question we're about to address in about a minute, is to what extent was Burleigh composing these songs, and to what extent was he arranging these songs? And we're going to give you two examples. The first is Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and the second is Deep River. The earliest recording we have of the Fisk Singers from 1909 is Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. So we'll listen to some of that, and then we'll hear Sidney sing Burleigh's Swing Low. In the case of Deep River, it's a fascination that this song, which was the iconic black spiritual in the 19-teens and 1920s, thanks to Burleigh, is an obscure spiritual in the 1870s. In the Fisk songbooks, it's not even harmonized. And it doesn't sound very much like Burleigh's Deep River. So Sidney's going to sing the unharmonized Deep River that survives from these 1870s songbooks, and then we'll hear what Burleigh did with it. So here first is Swing Low, and then Deep River. Can we hear the Fisk 1909 Swing Low, please?
Swing low, sweet chariot. looked over Jordan, what did I see? Coming for to carry me home, a band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Oh, don't you want to go to the gospel feast, that promised land where all is peace? Lord, I want to cross over into campground. 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 Jordan.
Thank you. So Burleigh was also famous as a singer, and he composed art songs, which for the most part don't sound black. Burleigh's fame as a composer of art songs began in the teens, and it survived into the 20s, which is to say that the most famous recitalists, Lawrence Tibbett, John McCormick, Louise Homer, all of them white, sang both the spirituals of Harry Burleigh and the art songs until you get to the late 20s. And then the art songs fall out of favor because they're unfashionable. Allen already mentioned this. We're talking now about a new aesthetic, modernism. Burleigh's a romantic nationalist. So the music that he spawns as a beginning figure in this buried history of black classical music goes underground. And mainly we have 4 composers for orchestra coming after Burleigh. Burleigh did not write for orchestra. And they are William Lavie Dawson, whom Allen mentioned, William Grant Still, Florence Price, and Nathaniel Dett. And this music is not known, I would say, for 2 reasons. One obvious, which has to do with race, and the other not so obvious, although you've already heard it belabored this evening, which is a new aesthetic that's not very comfortable with the vernacular. It's kind of neoclassical and francophile. So by the time Burleigh composes the song that we're about to perform, which may be his peak achievement, his art songs have faded from the repertoire. This is his setting of Lovely, Dark, and Lonely One by Langston Hughes, 1935. This is the kind of music that we need to be excavating right now, along with the Dawson Symphony. It's still on the very fringes of the recital repertoire. It seems to me one of the peak achievements in the art song repertoire by Americans. And it's also Burleigh's valedictory. This is his final art song. He could have composed more, but I think he found himself so unfashionable at this moment that, like certain other composers one could name, like Sibelius or Elgar or Manuel de Falla, he felt estranged by a new aesthetic fashion. Anyway, he's taking a song by Langston Hughes that expresses impatience and crafting it in such a way that the song expresses faith and forbearance. I think it's a picture of Harry Burleigh. He wrote it for Marian Anderson, whom he mentored. She never sang it. It's a song personal to Burleigh, and I will remind Sidney that we're going to hear the poem first, and then this is a rare occasion to hear what may be Burleigh's masterpiece, Lovely, Dark, and Lonely One.
Lovely, dark, and lonely one, bare your bosom to the golden sun. Do not be afraid of light, you who are a child of right. Open wide your arms to life, whirl in the wind of pain and strife. Face the wall with the dark closed gate. Beat with tireless hands and wait. Wait. Wait.
I'm a little concerned that his mic is on. Whoever's controlling sound.
He just turned it on so that I could speak the text.
Okay. It's worth knowing, though, Sidney, that
Yes.
Hughes does not repeat the word wait. The poem actually begins wait. It's
Absolutely.
Burleigh who repeats the word, as you'll find out.
Lovely, dark, and lonely one, bear your bosom to the golden sun. Do not be afraid of light. with tireless hands and away.
I'll say a few more words, and then we'll have a conversation. So the story that we're encapsulating, this history of black classical music, after Dvorak and Du Bois, you have Samuel Coleridge Taylor, the once famous British black composer who was perceived to be the great black hope by Du Bois and others. And he came to the United States 3 times, took an interest in the spirituals of African Americans, wrote a set of Negro melodies for solo piano, published in 1905. But it seems to me that Coleridge Taylor ultimately was not the person to do the job, too British, too genteel. And it was only a year after he dies, in 1912, that Burleigh takes up the mantle and composes his first settings of Deep River. After that, as I mentioned, the story goes underground, and what you have instead is what I call in my book the standard narrative of American classical music, which is a product of the writings mainly of Aaron Copland and Virgil Thompson, and later Leonard Bernstein. Alan already referred to this. This is a narrative that insists that there's no music worth paying attention to before 1910 or 1915. So it omits this motherlode of black music, and it omits a rather important American composer named Charles Ives. In fact, it seems to me, in my book, that the 2 towering creative figures in American classical music are Ives and George Gershwin, both marginalized by this modernist standard narrative as inspired dilettantes. So what I advocate, I call the new paradigm, and it privileges the vernacular, black classical music, Ives, Gershwin. I'll just say a few more words about Gershwin and Ives because these gentlemen are going to be talking about Gershwin and Ives. When I wrote my book, Classical Music in America, I was amazed to discover that no American-born classical musician seemed to have anything nice to say about George Gershwin. I called this the Gershwin threat. The classical musicians who liked Gershwin were always European-born. It could be Ravel, it could be Schoenberg, it could be Otto Klemperer, it could be Fritz Reiner. So if we can reinstate Gershwin and reinstate Ives as crucial figures in this narrative, it opens up a world of possibilities. Not only do we get a more diverse and inclusive narrative, but Ives in particular links to the greatest figures in American cultural history. He links to people like Whitman and Melville and the Transcendentalists. And I'm grateful and amazed that we have a major American historian, this guy sitting to my left, who actually knows and cares about classical music because it's not been part of the narrative of American culture. And indeed, it seems to be that both Ives and Gershwin deserve to be placed rather differently in the pantheon of American culture. So that's how I expand the frame of this topic, and I'm going to hand the evening over to Alan. Alan, it's yours.
Well, I'm going to hand the evening, at least at this moment, back over to John McWhorter, because in mentioning Gershwin, you almost at once are going to mention Porgy and Bess. And Porgy and Bess has been written off in, let us call them, formal circles, as not being serious composition, as being maybe a slightly more elegant version of a Broadway musical, but not really to be taken as a serious model for serious composition. I suspect this is a mistake of major proportions. And to open that up, I turn to John McWhorter, who has done something I've never done. He's actually written about Porgy and Bess and about Gershwin, and if I'm not wrong, even sung some of it. So, John, the baton, so to speak, is in your hand.
Thank you. The idea that Porgy and Bess is some sort of wedding cake is a mistake, and I think it comes from the fact that there are various parts of it that are eminently infectious, and some of them sound rather like Broadway. And so you suppose that you're at a Broadway musical that just has a whole lot of extra music. And that was never how I processed it, because I was first given Porgy and Bess when the Houston Opera did their production in 1976. And I was 10 years old. And you know, my mother dragged me. I didn't know this whole business of what's a musical and what's an opera. I just knew that I was at something called Porky and Bess. That's what I thought it was. And we were at a matinee. And you know, I was just torn to pieces. I thought it was amazing. And here's something that I shouldn't say too loud. I'm not a huge opera fan. I can fake it. I've got my favorite operas, but I am more a musicals person. I am not somebody who saw La Traviata and was in tears listening to the opera. I'm not that type. It was Porgy and Bess. And when Porgy and Bess did Bess You Is My Woman Now, I remember being 10 and just sitting there and thinking, this is the best music I've ever heard, except for that scene, My Man's Gone Now, about 20 minutes before that. And what I liked about it was that it was infectious, this music, but it was also profound. It was also classical, but it was the very best of classical. And there are pieces of it that run through my mind all the time. For example, Sidney, I sang a little of this at you very briefly about an hour ago. The Lonesome Road passage for Porgy.
Yes.
Porgy, listen to me here, and now I'm 57, for Porgy.
Yes.
And even in the original production, I remember grabbing onto the idea that whenever Porgy comes on, there's this yada yada da, and I thought, oh, that's good. And there's nothing trivial about it. And then when he sings that life is a lonesome road,
Yes.
to me, that was one of the best parts of it. And it still is. Or when the men are shooting craps and kind of tapping on each other, and you listen to the music in the back, and there's all this Ravellian, weird, chromatic stuff
Yes.
going on. It sounds one part happy, one part foreshadowing tragedy, and one part just good food. You know, that's really, really special music, and you get 3 hours of it. And so the idea that Porgy and Bess is something other than real opera simply holds no scientific water at all. The fact that something pleases the senses immediately cannot be said to make something automatically trivial. And the truth is that really I am fascinated by Gershwin more than anyone, as in the question of what he would have done if he happened to have lived.
Yeah.
Porgy and Bess happens to come, and he doesn't have much longer after 1935. He would have done more operas. They would have sounded like that, but better, etc. And he didn't. And if he had, Joe, I think that maybe it would be clearer to the mandarins that you're talking about, or maybe they would have been listened to less, that what Gershwin was doing was where a real American classical music ought to go, as opposed to thinking of him as something out in the back alley that mainly black people like, which was the way Porgy and Bess was dismissed until that 70s production where things changed. I sang Porgy in a bizarre production in Oakland about 30 years ago, where they had certain actors playing Porgy and Bess doing the script, and then 2 people doing the singing. and it was me and a Bess, and she was a lot of fun. We did pretty well, actually, and I insisted on putting the Lonesome Road thing in. However, I am not a professional singer, but even then, I realized we are working as hard as anybody who next door is perhaps doing Electra or Lulu. We were doing hard work because Gershwin wrote real music. And in general, I think that we really have missed, just because of his under 40 years of life, that the American classical music story should not go through Copland and Thompson, for example, Thompson, music that frankly people don't really even listen to. You can't say that about Copland, but it really should be a matter of stirring up the soil that we have here and making a classical music that makes sense only here, in the same way that Janáček really only makes sense in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. It didn't happen. I think we're working on it now. It's in a way harder to do in the substrate that we have to deal with today than it was in the 1930s. But that kind of music should be heard again in all of its splendor, because it's where the story should have gone. Joe, you've made me realize how bizarre it is to imagine that where the story was supposed to go was Copland, as lovely as that music is, that's what the story is supposed to be, and then move on from there into music that is willfully unlistenable, and that's supposed to be the American story. No, that's not a very good story. And so I wish that Gershwin had lived to give us more of Porgy and Bess, and I try with my students in the music class I teach to give them a sense of why Porgy and Bess is important, other than that I've Got Plenty of Nuttin' is catchy. Frankly, that's easy. I remember listening, there were things called LPs, I tell my students, listening to the LP, and even when I was 10, I thought, I've Got Plenty of Nuttin' sounds like something from a Looney Tune. That one's easy. It's those darker ones that I like as you get further along. It really requires close listening, as in, it's high opera, it's deep music, it's significant, it's our story, and it will always be one of my favorite things on earth. That's Porgy and Bess.
Yeah.
John, would I be wrong if I say that what we're diagnosing here is a musical world, an American musical world that we have lost? And we've lost it in a variety of ways. We've lost it through forgetfulness. We have forgotten about Harry Burleigh. We have, when I say forgotten, I don't mean an accidental forgetfulness. I mean a deliberate forgetfulness, a deliberate turning away. We have forgotten about Dvorak's prophecy. If it's mentioned at all, it's only mentioned in context of music that Dvorak himself wrote, and oh, isn't that quaint that he did that? And just stigmatizing it as quaint is really a way of dismissing and pushing it aside.
Thompson said hackneyed.
Yes, well, hackneyed, well, there's many words that are applied to it, and all of them are pejorative.
And he called Gershwin gefilte fish.
Yes.
Too.
Yeah, and here we are taking an entire musical world, and we're seeing it disappear, or made to disappear. And whether it's Burleigh, whether it's Nathaniel Dett, whether it's Gershwin, sometimes people are being made completely invisible. Other times, people are simply being defined. Gershwin is just a kind of jumped up popular songwriter from Tin Pan Alley. But this also becomes a way of dismissing.
He's déclassé, and he's tainted by the black experience.
Yes, because all these flow together, because what is being articulated in this past we have lost. It is a world of American vernacular music that now becomes stigmatized. Now, we've talked about Dvorak warning us against that. And Dvorak does this because although he's a Bohemian, a Czech composer, nevertheless, he spends 3 very important years in America. In 1893, a very wealthy New York woman decided that it was time to found a National Conservatory of Music in New York City. And in so doing, she went shopping for the best European talent she could hire, the assumption being there was no equivalent American talent. But she hired Antonín Dvořák. And Dvorak comes to America, and what he finds here is a total, utter surprise to him. He finds a musical landscape that he's just begging to be noticed. And it is a musical landscape of an American vernacular. And Dvorak's complaint is, where are American composers who are using this? I mean, it's as though you have opened up a treasure chest of jewels and pearls and somehow forgotten to sink your hands into it. And when Dvorak is, and he says this repeatedly over a 3-year period, it's one piece after another he's publishing in the newspapers and the magazines, and he's basically saying, Americans, will you please wake up to what you see all around you? This is what I did back in my native Bohemia. I listened to the peasant songs, and I incorporated them into my music. You should do the same thing in America. You should take, especially, the plantation songs. They are the bedrock of an authentic American musical identity. But this was a prophecy which did not come true in most cases. And it is a prophecy which could have come true in the hands of people like Harry Burleigh. It is a prophecy whose promise was there in the music of Gershwin, but it became a road not taken. Now there's one other figure, and I want to talk about this figure for a few moments, mainly because Joe's invited me to talk about him, and that is Charles Ives. So I'm going to take the music stand. I'm not going to sing, don't worry. But I want to talk about Ives because Ives, it seems to me, is yet another example of what we were talking about here, of this erasure. William Dawson, who I mentioned at the very beginning, William Levi Dawson, head of the music program at Tuskegee Institute for all of his career. Dawson and Harry Burleigh are two of the examples of the erasure that I described at the beginning tonight. To them, we have to add black composers like Nathaniel Dett, William Grant Still. We even have to add other American composers who did take Dvorak's prophecy seriously, like George Whitfield Chadwick, a white New Englander, but nevertheless paid serious attention to what our friend Dvorak was talking about. Arthur Farwell, Henry Gilbert, even George Frederick Bristow. These aren't names that you conjure with in writing the curriculum of American music. They're just not there, but they should be. The problem is that when modern critics like Van Wyck Brooks published America's Coming of Age in 1915, what he launched was a critique of American culture which took large portions of America's literary, philosophical, and artistic past and simply tipped them into the dustbin of forgetfulness, along with its music. So that nothing in American culture, literary, musical, artistic, nothing in American culture before 1910, 1915, not Frederick Church, the painter, not Josiah Royce, the philosopher, were spared from the oblivion of what Joe Horowitz has called pastlessness. And maybe the most embarrassing example of this pastlessness was the composer who was actually too great even for the modernists to erase, at least not to erase entirely, and that was Charles Ives. There's no evidence that Ives ever read Dvorak's prophecy in the newspapers because he was still a Yale undergraduate at the time, and he was laboring under the heavy tutelage of a genuinely forgettable American composer, Horatio Parker. I don't know if there's any fans of Horatio Parker out there. If so, please do not throw anything at me. But in a larger sense, Ives almost instinctively followed Dvorak's lead. The English horn solo in the slow movement of Ives's First Symphony, which he wrote when he was still under Parker's eye, still writing textbook-style music, still bears an uncanny resemblance to the famous English horn solo in the slow movement of Dvorak's New World Symphony, which is also linked to Harry Burleigh as Goin' Home. And Ives's major orchestral works, from his Second Symphony onwards, teem with allusions to American popular song, to the band music of the Civil War, to the gospel hymns of revival meetings, to holiday celebrations of the 4th of July in small New England towns like Ives's own native Danbury, Connecticut. His piano portrait from the 114 songs, the anti-abolitionist riots of the 1830s and 40s, are as close to a musical portrait as we're likely to get of an enraged mob attacking an abolitionist meeting. Ives's experiments in ragtime point toward Gershwin. Ives's use of cumulative form rather than the classical sonata conjure up echoes of organ preludes and improvisations, because Ives's original career as a musical performer was as a church organist. Now, Ives had been warned by Horatio Parker that subjects like that were beneath the dignity of serious composition, but Ives ignored him, and in just the way that Dvorak might have applauded. Ives's Third Symphony, which he composed and revised between 1901 and 1912, is probably the greatest American symphony ever written. I would strike out the probably. But it breaks all the rules the modernists adored for fashioning mathematical art. Instead, Ives's Third Symphony teems with hymn tunes. Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing. There is a fountain filled with blood. And celebrations of Sunday communion services. But at no point does Ives come closer to Dvorak's prophecy than in the first movement of his Three Places in New England, which describes Augustus St. Gordon's monument to Robert Gould Shaw and the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers in the Civil War. The 54th Massachusetts was, as Ives' subtitle, Colonel Shaw and his Colored Regiment. 54th Massachusetts, we are reminded, was the first black regiment to be recruited for the Union Army after the Emancipation Proclamation. One of the first to earn national honors for the fighting around Fort Wagner in South Carolina, where Shaw and many of his black soldiers were killed. It is a brooding piece with a throbbing, dirge-like march pattern, laced with popular plantation songs and Civil War band tunes, all of them culminating in one of the most heart-rending moments in American music, where the battle cry of freedom is introduced as if it were a threnody for Shaw and his men. It is music that mourns and honors the 54th Massachusetts all at the same moment. But you know, Three Places had to wait until 1930 for its first performance. And even then, it wasn't performed again until 1948. The Third Symphony had to linger until 1947 for its New York debut. Now, part of the reason lies is in the complexity of Ives's writing, its polytonality, its polyrhythms. That makes his work a challenge for both performers and for listeners. But another part of that hesitation is the same reasoning that ignored Dvorak's prophecy. In the end, not even the modernists, Virgil Thomson, Aaron Copland, Leonard Bernstein, not even they could ignore Ives, even if it did come from what Bernstein disparagingly snubbed as the kindergarten period of American music. But they did try to redefine him, taking Ives's polyrhythms and tone clusters and dissonances and polytonality as a kinship with their own experiments in serialism. But Ives is most certainly not their kin, any more than Gershwin or Burleigh. He is a romantic nationalist whose music evokes nostalgia for an American world Charles Ives had known as a youth A world inhabited by his father, who was a Civil War bandmaster. A world whose passing in the 20th century infuriated Ives. His music is not an exercise in compositional, sterile architecture. It recreates the milieu of a world he had lost. A world of an organ grinder on a train platform, of competing marching bands on a small town square, of the abolitionists and the transcendentalists, in a time that had slipped away even as Ives lived. Ives, too, is an embodiment of this American vernacular, of this musical world we have lost. Ives is also an embodiment of Dvorak's prophecy, also a road not taken. Now I'm going to turn this, having said this, I'm going to turn this back to Sidney Outlaw, because he too has something to say on the subject of Porgy and Bess.
Oh.
You're on. You're on.
You know, I love Porgy and Bess. I always think of Porgy and Bess as a verismo opera. I think that it is very much, to sing it, that's real singing. In particular, the last act, just before Porgy decides to leave to go look for Bess, that's very much Verdian singing. You don't realize it unless you are in it singing it. And you realize, whoa, this is like real verismo singing. Serena's aria, My Man's Gone Now, that's real verismo singing. And so I was just astonished to hear that people think of it as not serious opera. It's opera. It's like, you better eat your Wheaties, because this is, you know, and if you're lucky enough to get a great orchestra to play it, I always think of Gershwin as an ally to the Black community. He did his research. He went to Charleston. The reason it sounded that way was because he lived amongst them in Charleston. So when you hear the Strawberry Woman singing, Strawberry, he literally heard her doing that. And if you go to Charleston today on the pier, they still do that. You can still buy crabs and strawberries from the Strawberry Man or the Crab Man down there. And so I've always felt like he used Western classical music styles and dipped it in Black culture, because he was able to live amongst Black people. He was able to see how we were living during that time. Was he Black? No, but you know, neither was Eminem, but he's a great rapper. He's a guest. He's a guest, you know, and so I always think of it like that, you know. The rapper Moni Love, she's not American, but she's a great rapper. She's British. She's from Great Britain, you know, and so I think of Porgy and Bess, Porgy, as my grandmother calls him, Porgy, in that vernacular. And the first time I've never sang Porgy, but I've sang Jake. And it was my debut at Spoleto in 2016. And it was a full-blown production to be able to do Porgy and Bess in Charleston, 3 blocks away from the real Catfish Row. And the people of Charleston came out so much that they had to put jumbotrons on the front lawn of the Gaillard Center, and everybody came, and the house was full, and so was the front lawn of the Opera House. And so that was my first experience with Porgy on the operatic stage. Of course, of saying, you know, I Got Plenty of Nothing, things like that in recitals. The idea of the banjo, that was one of the main instruments for us for entertainment. And there's different types of banjos. And so whenever I heard the banjo and I Got Plenty of Nothing, it makes sense to me, because that's the instrument that they would have played back then. That and the cowbell and different things. They didn't have like formal instruments. And so there were so many aspects of Porgy and Bess, especially growing up in that region. I'm from North Carolina, that made sense to me, like it was just regular life. Of course they use this. Of course they talk like this. This is how we talk at home. What are you talking about, you know? So that was my experience with it. I'm very careful with Porgy and Bess because a lot of times people will say, oh, well, we want Sidney to come and perform Porgy and Bess. First of all, they asked me to do Porgy, and I'm not a Porgy. My voice isn't that heavy. I'm a Jake. So after we clear that up, then they say, well, you come and do this, and then they won't hire you for anything else until the next time they do Porgy. And so when you ask my experience with that, I love Porgy and Bess, I love singing it, but I'm also very careful with my team to make sure that I'm not being used for that because I sing, Black people are not just one thing. We can sing other things as well. And so that's how I'm careful with it. I'm gonna sing Jake in Porgy and Bess. Okay, 3 seasons from now, I'd love to sing Mercutio. And I'd like to tie that to that contract to make sure that I'm not being taken advantage of in that regard.
Hey, Sidney, can I ask you something?
Mm-hmm.
On that, I have a fantasy that not now, but in 50 years, white people can do Porgy and Bess. The idea that if it's an American opera,
Yes.
and if all of us are people,
Yes.
then there should be white people who sing that music too.
Yes.
Not next week, but
Yes.
how do you feel about that, and who gets hired for what,
Yes.
and what the modern realities are?
White people are already singing Porgy and Bess.
You mean in Europe?
Well, I mean here, like even in like, you hear people singing arias from the opera. I'm cool with that as long as arts administrators of opera companies are going to be willing to hire Black people for regular standard repertoire.
Right.
Because Mr. Gershwin wrote it, said, Black people perform this because they ain't got a chance to perform anything else. So that's why I love that you say in about 50 years, because you got to get the turnaround time. You know, everybody's got a turnaround time, you know, the changeover at companies all the time, you know. And so, yeah, possibly, as long as
Black singers can also...
Absolutely. Yeah. Don't just hire me to sing this role because it's a Black role and we need a Black face to do this. You know, oh, I'm writing this new opera and it's got a Black guy in it. You want to sing it? Well, I am kind of broke right now, but, you know, I don't know, let me think about it, you know. And so it's that happens more often than not. And I typically use my students as an excuse to not take the gig. Oh, sorry, I got to teach, you know. And so, you know, because you have to be careful with that. But cool, that's cool as long as that's
ideal. Yeah.
Yeah, as long, for me, as long as that playing field is level and I don't know, Janae Bridges can walk into the room and say, I want to sing or I'm auditioning for this and literally be considered and given that role where they say, oh, the director wanted this. Okay, well, you know, but yeah, cool. You know, things change, Joe, you know.
I have a book about Porgy and Bess. It's really about Rouben Mamoulian. It's called On My Way, The Untold Story of Rouben Mamoulian, George Gershwin, and Porgy and Bess, that's relevant to this discussion. First of all, if it's not self-evident, Porgy and Bess is the fulfillment of Dvorak's prophecy. There it is. It's the exception that proves the rule, period. And I completely, emphatically agree with John. The greatest what if in the history of American classical music is, what if Gershwin had lived as long as Copland? It would have been a new story. We wouldn't be having this conversation right now. We would have our American music. We would no longer be suffering from this chronic condition of American classical music still being Eurocentric. Anyway, the thing that I learned in the Mamoulian archive is that the character of Porgy, both in the opera Porgy and Bess and in the play Porgy, was created by Mamoulian, not by the Haywards. You begin with the book by DuBose Hayward, Porgy, in which Porgy is a rather insignificant character who at the end of the novel sinks into obscurity. And with his wife, he created a play. Through a series of circumstances, it wound up in the hands of a 29-year-old neophyte director named Rouben Mamoulian, who later would direct Oklahoma and Carousel. And Mamoulian was a student of Russian experimental theater, and his godhead was a guy named Vakhtangov, And for Mamoulian, the template for theater was the miracle play. And if you go to the theater, there should be an uplifting and redemptive ending. So he rejected the character of Porgy. He rejected the ending of the play and the novel Porgy. And the Porgy ending that we know and the Porgy character that we know are both the creation of an Armenian white immigrant named Rouben Mamoulian. As far as Mamoulian was concerned, Porgy and Bess were redemption dramas. So if you're looking at Porgy and Bess, an opera you might think of as resembling Porgy and Bess right off the bat would be Parsifal by Richard Wagner. For Mamoulian, who rejected all thought of verisimilitude, who objected when the Theater Guild promoted the play Porgy as an authentic representation of Gullah life, for Mamoulian, this play and this opera was a parable about a cripple made whole, a cripple both emotionally and physically. This is a story that transcends race. And my personal opinion is that until we have a white Porgy, the full stature and the very identity of this opera will remain obscure. When the production that's at the Met right now by James Robinson was premiered by the English National Opera and was reviewed in The Guardian, it got a very nice review from a critic who said, without meaning to be pejorative, that the opera is a period piece. She could only say that because she thought it's an opera about black people. And as long as this opera is an opera about black people, we will never recognize its full stature. I'll say one more thing, which is that the greatest recordings of the songs of Porgy, maybe even of Jake's song, were made, and the first recordings in 1935 by Lawrence Tibbett. And Lawrence Tibbett was the greatest of all American operatic baritones. He happened to specialize in singing black, but he was white. And it's our loss that Tibbett was never permitted to sing the role of Porgy on stage. I'm not saying that he could have or should have, given the historical circumstances, but if you know anything about Lawrence Tibbett, the thought of Tibbett, who was a great, great singing actor, as Porgy is a mind-boggling thought. I have never heard or seen a production of Porgy and Bess that can actualize the ending, because the ending of this opera is two endings. You first have Gershwin's ending, which is Hayward's ending, "Oh Bess, oh where's my Bess?"
Yeah.
And then you have Mamoulian's ending, "Oh Lord, I'm on my way." Those words are Mamoulian's, and it was Mamoulian's idea to end both the play and the opera with everybody singing, "Oh Lord, I'm on my way." That comes from Mamoulian. How do you get from the one ending to the other? There's a linchpin, and it's the line, "Bring my goat."
Yes.
And unless that line registers as a sudden epiphany that this man is going to rise up and be redeemed and redeem the community, you can't realize the opera. Nowadays, since we don't have a goat on stage, we don't even have the line to help us. And those directors who use instead the line, "Bring my crutch," are people who don't understand this opera. The last thing that Porgy wants at this redemption moment is a crutch. So I feel that this is the most misunderstood opera in the entire repertoire, and it remains so. And alas, I do believe it will remain so unless and until we have great white singers singing these roles as well as great black singers.
The last production I did, Thomas Cannon, great baritone, said, "Bring me my goat." But Everett McCorvey was the director.
Was there a goat?
No.
So how could he say, "Bring my goat"?
Well, what happened
he
was,
said it.
he said it, and the light cue cued the orchestra. Oh Lord. They did, like, that's how we ended the show. We ended the show that way in
Well,
Greensboro.
it's hard to bring the goat
Yeah.
when there's no goat.
I think that there was no goat because I don't think the Greensboro Zoo was going to let us have a goat. But I do remember, and then the whole COVID thing. But I do remember.
What happened at the Met the last time they did it is they used "Bring my cart."
Yeah.
So Porgy,
I've heard
at
Bring
this
My Cart,
point in
too.
the opera, we've never seen the cart, but you
Yes.
saw it then.
Yes.
And they were able to avoid having Porgy sing Bring My Goat. Bring My Crutch.
Bring My Crutch.
Bring
Yeah.
My Crutch.
There has been a great subtraction. And the subtraction, and this is what has brought me into the circle of this discussion most directly. It's a subtraction which has occurred on a number of levels, not just of music, where an entire American world of music has been effaced. And we see where it might possibly have gone in the hands of Gershwin or Ives or Dawson. But we also have to see that kind of erasure at multiple levels in American culture. And there are losses that we have sustained from our past, whether it is literary or philosophical or artistic, that are wounds, that make us today less than we could be. And when I reflect on the music of Harry Burleigh, when I reflect on Dvorak's prophecy, I'm looking in a very broad sense for what has been abandoned, what has been consigned to pastlessness. Now, I could say perhaps I have that longing because I'm a history person. That's what history people do. Like archaeologists dig. History people wish that we could recover more of the past. But I think in a very larger sense for a workable a notion of American identity. An American identity which is significantly wrapped not around issues of race or soil or ethnicity or religion or language, but is wrapped around propositions. Proposition especially, articulated by Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, that all men are created equal. How do you make a nation out of a proposition? In Lincoln's day, they laughed at it. Well, he had a better laugh. People today continue to laugh at it. What is our best response? I think it's reaching deep into that treasure chest of American cultural jewels and realizing what tremendous riches we have at our fingertips. And all we have to do is reach down and grasp them. What I'd like to do at this point is to open the floor for some questions from the audience. And I believe we have Jonathan and Christy with microphones. So as you have questions, what I'd ask you to do is put a hand up, jump up and down, make yourself visible. We'll bring you a microphone, and please speak into the microphone because we are doing recording of this and we want to make sure that your question gets clearly recorded. So I would say hands up for those who want to speak. And Christy, if you look to your left, I think you will see some people with hands. There we go. All right.
Hi, I'm Rochelle Ellis. I'm on the voice faculty here at Princeton University, and I'm thrilled to be here because I'm teaching a class on African American art song right now. And we had a class not too long ago about Harry Burleigh and Dvorak. And I think it's so wonderful to hear the idealistic way you speak about this music. But in reality, until this country can deal with the day-to-day issues of race and gender, none of this will ever be. You were talking about Porgy and Bess, and I was in Porgy and Bess. I played Serena at the New York City Opera, and it's the same thing. You don't want to get caught into the Porgy and Bess vortex. As a black singer, you won't be able to do anything else. Fabulous music, great experience, but you take it and move on. I'm more concerned as a teacher of voice to bring out all of the African American art song composers like dear Harry Burleigh, and he lucked out because he worked for Ricordi and he was able to get his stuff published only because he worked for an Italian publisher. Florence Price, you know, in Chicago, Margaret Bonds, they had a harder time. as women to be able to get anything published.
Yes.
And it's tons and tons of people who are out, and even the young people who are writing today. I go on their websites, they're like sending me their music, please perform my music.
Yep.
We're having a recital of from the students in my class at the end of the month. It's like, I'm so happy that finally some of these things are coming out. I've been singing for 40 years, and I never knew any of this music. I went through university all the way up to my doctorate and never was exposed to this music. That's a shame, outside of Deep River and every spiritual known to man.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad you sang the Lonely, Dark, and Lovely One. And I really, if you all want more information on African American art song, go to the African Art Song Alliance. Daryl Taylor, Louise Toppin, these people have done fabulous work of bringing out the composers who are living today, and composers who just were trying to make their way in the world at a time when Jim Crow was keeping anybody from doing anything. So basically, I love Charles Ives. I've sung a lot of his music. He did a lot of, did things with the spirituals too. Yes. Let's be honest, this is America. If you were doing anything that was steeped in African American and even the Indian culture, or Native American culture, you just weren't going to get any play. People poo-pooed Dvorak. They thought he was, what are you talking about? We're not going to do this music. They considered that, to be minstrel, Broadway, from vaudeville. They weren't going to do any Negro anything, and certainly weren't going to consider it to be American culture. And it really has gotten better since Eminem and people like that. Some of the young people know the. Look at everything Little Richard had to go through, arguing with the Beatles.
Absolutely.
Elvis Presley, who basically stole a lot of, So it's the racism in this country always is a pall that just hangs over this country, and until something is done with that, I don't think I would want to see a white Porgy, but they'd have, maybe if they did a modern day version of it, and she was on crack or something like that. I mean, I don't think you could do it in that setting and have it, because the whole point of it was what was going on with these people who lived that kind of way. So that's just me.
Very good.
Nice. One thing about Mr. Burleigh, he was a big mentor for Florence Price. He did try to get some of her works published, but we were talking earlier about times changing, and they thought like a lot of his music was old-fashioned. There was a letter that Gene Snyder let me read where he was telling Florence Price how much he loved her music, but right now at this point he couldn't get it published through recording because of some things that were going on during that time, So I do know that, Mr. Burleigh was a big mentor to a lot of singers, especially a lot of the women composers, and tried to help them, Yes, absolutely. Yes to all of that.
Questions still. We're not on the front here. I think this gentleman had his hand up, was very patient, waiting to be noticed.
Thank you. Do I have to press on? Okay. Professor McWhorter, I think you wrote something that very illuminating that partially answers your question about white performers and so forth. You, in response to the criticisms of the Porgy and Bess characters being stereotypes, you made the distinction that they were not stereotypes, they were archetypes. And it seems to me that distinction really relates to what the difference of it not, well, simultaneously being something that's rooted in the Black experience and also being the characters being archetypal relates it to the whole international canon of classical music. And it seems that perhaps it's that when perhaps the connection between here and white performers performing Porgy and Bess, the link has to be for the recognition of the Porgy and Bess having these archetypal characters which transcends race, even though the expression of the archetypal characters and the plot is embedded very deeply and well musically and factually in the Black experience.
Yeah, and it's going to take a while. I mean, the only way that we could start to see Porgy and Bess that way is if our racial climate were different, if there were less inequality, if we could be sure that Black people could play any role that they were suited for and that was no longer an issue. This is an America that we can barely imagine at this point. But
Even
if
today.
we got to that point, and you know, change does happen. It happens slowly, but it does happen. If we got to that point, then we could start to see that Bess does not need to be a Black woman in 1935 suffering in an all-Black quarter in the Sea Islands, which is what one sees. One wouldn't see Porgy and Bess as this is Black people and it's portraying them and stereotyping them. This is all that one sees. For example, if we get to the point that we're so far from that being the only kind of portrait we see of Black people, and we've certainly come away since 1935, and we're going to come even further, then we could open up to the idea that a white person could sing those archetypes where the music is so fat, the music is so dense, that it gives us real people, as opposed to reviving a Black musical comedy from 1905 that doesn't have real characters and where they are Black people on a street in Washington, D.C. in 1905, and that's all that we would ever see them as. It'll take a while, but I think because it is high art, we can see a kernel, at least at this point, of Porgy as a human being. But it's going to take a while. We're not going to do that now. But we will have really gotten somewhere when we can start imagining it.
We have a question over here on this side.
Thank you for this evening's presentation. I wonder if you could speak a little more about Europeans coming and having a fresh and clear view of African American culture. Dvorak here, of course, the many African American jazz and blues performers who went over to France and were venerated, as they should have been too. And of course, here in Princeton, we know very well that Albert Einstein and the other intellectual emigres and refugees here had a fresh view of race and were horrified at the segregation they saw. Speaking of opera, of course, Marian Anderson, singing here but could not stay in one of the local hotels. The Einsteins insisted, come use our guest room, be our guest. I'm wondering if there's more on the side of, there are more Dvoraks in other fields, in painting or other art, who came here from Europe, saw this fresh, incredible ocean of influences and talent and art, and did similar or tried to do what Dvorak was trying to do.
I can tell you that in my book, this is not an answer to your question, but it's pertinent to your question. I say that an antipathy to jazz is one of the defining traits of American classical music after World War I. And in another of my books, I write about the jazz threat as being particular to the United States. And this is a well-known fact, really, that if you're in Paris or Berlin in the 30s, jazz is not the threat that it is in the United States. But you're asking a different question. It's just that your question made me think of something else.
Are there other Dvoraks in other fields who had this clear view and had the great experience of African American culture and tried to do what he tried to do?
Oh,
Was Jeanette Thurber European or was she American?
she's American.
She's American.
Yeah.
Because if she was European, I'd say, hey, Jeanette Thurber.
Yeah, you'd have to say that Jeanette Thurber, just in creating the the National Conservatory, because the National Conservatory astonished a number of observers when it was opened in 1893 because there was no color line.
Yeah.
That black students could apply and be accepted.
She
on an
wanted
equal
black
basis with whites.
students because
She was looking for
she
them.
felt
Yeah,
that
what-
they were enlightened musically. I just thought of a name, Henry Craybill. Does anybody know the name Henry
yeah,
Craybill?
Craybill.
So Henry Craybill is the leading critic, music critic in New York in this period, very closely associated with Dvorak. His father is a German immigrant who's a Methodist preacher in the Midwest, and Craybill becomes the leading writer on music and race. He's sort of an ethnomusicologist before ethnomusicology existed. He writes articles in the New York Herald with bibliographies about Hebrew music, Russian music, Native American music, and it's a level playing field for him. He gets in a big fight with Philip Hale, who's his opposite number in Boston, because for Hale, you're an American if you're a descendant from the Mayflower, and Hale had a very distinguished lineage, and he went to Yale and he went to Paris. Craybill was an autodidact who never went to college, so he kind of fits the bill, what you're talking about. He's not first gen, whatever you call it. I mean, his parents were immigrants, but boy, does he have a clear view. And this whole story is it's very hard to get your head around it when you consider that Dvorak is conducting an interracial orchestra in 1894 at the Madison Square Garden Concert Hall, which is the orchestra of the National Conservatory, in which Harry Burleigh is the timpanist, with a black chorus and two black soloists, one of whom is Harry Burleigh and the other of whom is Ciceretta Jones, who's the most famous black singer of her generation. This is 1894.
Yeah.
When do you first get it? You never get an integrated orchestra. Even today, we don't have a really integrated orchestra. I can't even think of an American professional orchestra that has more than a handful of black people. That was not the orchestra in 1894 of the National Conservatory. This is a real golden moment. Once you juxtapose it with Boston, it comes into very, very clear definition, because in Boston, all the writing about Dvorak invokes the notion of racial hierarchy. And Dvorak is classified scientifically as a Slav, which means that he's a lower rung than the Anglo-Saxons. You never find this rhetoric in the New York press. It's hard to believe. And when I discovered this, I couldn't believe it, and I conferred with the only two people I knew who were doing similar research, Robert Winter at UCLA and Michael Beckerman at NYU, and they said, yeah, we don't find it in New York in the 1890s.
It's on that note that I want to ask Joe and Sidney to close us out tonight with a way of invoking Dvorak and Burleigh and so many others in an arrangement of the tune that we'll recognize, I'm sure, at once from the slow movement of Dvorak's New World Symphony, but which was then refashioned as an art song that we recognize as Going Home. And as we're going home tonight, I think this might be a really good note on which to close, and I'm not using the word note as a pun either. So while Sidney and Joe arrange themselves at the piano, I just want to say a few words of thanks. I wish we could go on all night. We can't, but I will encourage you to explore this through Joe's book, Dvorak's Prophecy and the Vexed Fate of Black Classical Music. I want to thank a number of people and acknowledge a number of people who are here tonight. I'm wondering, I don't know if I have been able to see, but I think that Gene Jarrett, our Dean of Faculty, is here this evening. I was hoping. If he's here, thank you for being here. If he's not here, still, thank you anyway. John Miko, who's the head of the Legacy Foundation of the Union League of Philadelphia. John is here. It is his birthday today. That's how he's celebrating his birthday with us today. I want to thank our co-sponsor, the Princeton University Department of Music, and especially our host, the Nassau Presbyterian Church and its staff. I want to thank Jonathan Garaffa of the James Madison program staff, because Jonathan has worked and worked and worked overtime in making sure all the parts of this program have worked together. And then particularly to thank Joe Horowitz, Sidney Outlaw, and John McWhorter for every minute that we have enjoyed together this evening. And I want to thank you, our audience. So sing like you're going home, and stay in touch tonight and on other occasions through our James Madison program website, which is simply jmp.princeton.edu. But for our close, Sidney Outlaw and Joe Horowitz.
student of Dvorak's at the National Conservatory. And in 1922, he is the person who created Going Home out of the Largo from the New World Symphony. Something I didn't tell you before when we were listening to Deep River and discovering how different Burleigh's Deep River was from the Fisk Deep River is that Burleigh left 5 versions of Deep River, one of which is for a cappella male chorus, and it begins by quoting the Largo from the New World Symphony, which tells us something startling, that all roads lead to Dvorak, that this iconic spiritual, Deep River, made iconic by Harry Burleigh, was influenced by the Largo from the New World Symphony, which you're about to hear in another embodiment as Going Home.
Nothing's lost, all's gain. No more fret nor pain. No more stumbling on the way. No more longing for the day. Gone to roam no more. Morning star lights the way.
Sidney.